February the 23rd, a day of destiny for the people of Britain, as with the eyes of the world upon them, a record percentage went to the polls. From early morning, the polling stations were coping with a steady stream of voters, growing to a flood tide as the day went on.
In 1945, most commentators assumed that with a thumping majority of 145 seats in the House of Commons, the Labour Party would be in power for at least 2 terms, if not 3. Yet instead, at the 1950 election, the Labour majority was reduced to just 5 seats, and following the 1951 election, they would lose their majority, despite winning the most votes, and would then be out of power for 13 years, as the Conservative Party cemented their position as the so-called natural party of government, benefiting from a post-war boom which cemented them in office for the rest of the 1950s and into the 1960s. Yet despite the obvious value in exploring how and why this happened, the 1950 election remains a forgotten election, sandwiched as it was between the 1945 landslide and Churchill returning to power in 1951 at the ripe old age of 67. But what is striking about the 1950 election is that it didn't have to be this way. Had Clement Attlee held off redrawing constituency boundaries, it is estimated that Labour would have won a majority of 60 seats, which would surely have kept them in office for another 5 years, with the post-war boom potentially helping to keep them in office for longer. And perhaps Labour might have ended up as the natural party of government in these circumstances, with all of the counterfactual history that would have brought in train. As it was, however, Attlee was an honourable man, and the redrawing of constituency boundaries meant that even though Labour led the Conservatives in 1950 by 2.7 percentage points, this was largely a product of Labour stacking up votes in safe seats. They were reduced to a slender majority of just 5, which would leave Attlee in a much weaker position and would lead to another election in the following year, where the first-past-the-post system would work against them again, bringing Churchill back to power even though Labour won more votes in absolute terms in 1951 than in both 1945 and 1950, and even though they had a clear lead of 0.8 percentage points over the Tories in terms of votes cast. Labour went into the election in 1950 with huge domestic achievements, setting up the National Health Service, creating the modern welfare state, nationalising 20% of the economy, including railways, electricity and coal, and playing a key role in setting up the NATO alliance. But bankrupted by war, Britain was forced to accept American support during this period, which came with strings attached. The loan that was negotiated by John Maynard Keynes came with the stipulation that sterling had to be freely convertible into dollars. This led to a drain in dollar reserves and a crisis, which forced the government to devalue the pound, which increased import prices and led to further austerity measures and the extension of rationing to include bread for the first time. Attlee had wanted to delay the election until the summer, but his Chancellor, Stafford Cripps, who felt it was wrong to produce a budget just before an election, threatened to resign, and so an election was called on the 10th of January 1950. The Conservatives went into the election with a slender lead over Labour in the polls, which they had held for most of the Parliament, so it looked like they were favourites to win, and they also had a popular message to sell to the British people. They pledged to abolish the rationing system, which Labour wanted to maintain, creating a clear dividing line during the election campaign. Let's hear from Winston Churchill and then Clement Attlee with their rival visions at this election.
Ladies and gentlemen, permit me, please, to claim your attention for a moment. It can only be a moment, for of course, in this, and in most other things, we are all on the ration. The vote you will give on February the 23rd is of profound importance to your future. Your homes and families and our country are all involved. The choice is plain. Are we now to take another plunge into socialist regimentation, or shall we return to the high road of freedom, of enterprise, and with proper safeguards, opportunity for all. Under the socialist system, where everything is controlled by an all-powerful state, we cannot hope to uphold our standard of life and secure employment for the 50 millions crowded in our small island. If we are to be independent of foreign aid, we must rally all the genius, contrivance, initiative, and diligence of our people in a new surge of impulse and courage. The Conservative and National Liberal parties set in the forefront of their policy a basic standard below which even the weakest shall not be allowed to fall. And on this broad foundation, all should be free to make the best of themselves and their country, and to rise by their own exertions in the life of a free and active society. My friends, be under no illusions. It is an uphill road we have to tread. But if we reject the narrow, cramping doctrines of socialism, we shall surely find the way under a faithful and tolerant government to those broad uplands where plenty, peace, and justice reign.
"5 years of war inflicted great damage on our country. Valuable lives were lost. Much wealth was destroyed. Our trade was disrupted. Clearly, there would be hardships and shortages of many things to be endured. To achieve recovery would require a great effort on the part of all the men and women of Britain. During the last 4.5 years, a very fine effort has been made. Production in industry and agriculture has been greatly increased. The opportunity of working has been afforded to all, and the vast majority has worked well. The inevitable hardships and shortages have been, as far as was possible, shared by all. But so have the advantages. The great social security scheme has been applied to all. The result of Labour's policy is seen in the health of the people, especially of the children and of the babies. Never have they been so fine. Yes, Mr. Churchill calls this sharing misery. The question to be decided at this election is whether Labour's policy of fair shares for all is to continue, or whether, as under previous Conservative governments, the benefits are to go to one section of the people and the misery to another. I ask you to help us to continue the work of recovery so well begun.
The 1950 election serves as a salutary reminder that winning a massive landslide does not guarantee a government a long spell in power. Achieving this requires a party to translate a fragile electoral coalition into a governing coalition whose popular support can sustain them in office. In 1950, Attlee hoped to achieve this with a message of fairness and shared sacrifice as rationing continued. But the vicissitudes of the first-past-the-post system and Attlee's decision to go ahead with redrawing the electoral boundaries meant that the electoral system punished Labour, whose support was too concentrated in safe seats. Well, that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll watch some of my other videos. I've now covered almost every election between 1945 and the present day. For now, goodbye, and best wishes.